Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Welcome to Just Plain Theology from Rome, Sweet Rome. This is a program offered by Natalia Yuzian on location in Rome. Welcome, Natalia.
Hi, Bob. How are you today?
You're doing well.
Well, we're here today with a very special guest, Father Marcelo Solorzano, who is the head of the Spiritual Theology section of the Faculty of Theology here at the Angelicum. Welcome, Father. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Natalia.
I loved it. Whenever I have the Dominicans here, I think I want to call this Night at the Angelicum, Who Let the Dogs Out? Only Dominicans get that. Anyway, so this is great. Thank you very much for being here. Since we're in the month of May, and you happen to be teaching Mariology here at the school, I thought we could start first with your background. We could talk a little bit about that, but then I'd really like to talk about something we were chatting about before the show, which is some of the spiritual theology that you did your doctoral work in, and in terms of spirit and community and all that. That'd be interesting. So let's start from the beginning. Your background, where are you from, and how did you come to be a Dominican?
I was born in Nicaragua, and from Managua, Nicaragua, and that's a long history, involves a revolution, and eventually I come to the United States. And along the way, I was moved to seek. It's hard to express because I had very few formation on religious life or priesthood or anything, and so I just had a sense that I wanted to give more to God and dedicate myself more to God. I didn't know exactly what.
What age was that when that started?
I was about 17 when it started. I'd spoken to my father, and he said, well, that's wonderful. Why don't you just do college and then decide? Which brought me to the United States. And in the U.S., I studied architecture for 2 years.
And this was in Miami?
Miami. And halfway through it, I already knew that as much as I loved it, because I really liked it, I knew that I wasn't going to finish in architecture, that I wasn't going to do it, that I really needed to move on that. And so I spoke again to my parents, and I was put in contact with this sister. This sister is a Theresan sister. And she put me in contact with the diocese and the director of vocations. And with very little knowledge of anything, I was part of a group of people going into the seminary. And in the process, priesthood became part of the idea, although I wasn't so sure of exactly what I was discerning. So I entered the seminary. And along the way, I did see priesthood, but the venue, the place, the diocesan wasn't quite, I wasn't home, and which is normal, it can happen. And so for some time I was reading on Carmelites, Franciscans, and nothing seemed to kind of come home until I met the Dominicans in Miami, in Florida, and a friend of mine had left the seminary, had joined the Dominicans, came back to visit, and he was all gung-ho and wanted me, this is the order for you, you have to join the Dominicans. And I, needless to say, given my history, I was not very gung-ho on jumping on any bandwagon. I didn't want to jump into any decisions anymore. I wanted to be very careful. But in any case, I accepted an invitation to dinner at the Dominican house, and I arrived, and it was a group of guys living in community, washing dishes, telling jokes, speaking about preaching, and I was so comfortable and at home that it struck me. Then after our dinner, I went to Mass. One of the friars was preaching, and I really liked his preaching. And it was, to me at the time, was kind of a new way of preaching.
What was it that you followed?
It was it was taking really the scriptures to the life of the people involved, to the people who were celebrating there. And I don't remember exactly what he was doing. It just struck me as something that had a bearing on people's life, my life at the time. And I remember saying, this is like preaching from the heart. It wasn't, today's gospel says, da-da-da-da-da. It was really tying life with the good news. So I was very interested, but I stayed very quiet. I told my friend, don't tell him that I'm anywhere interested. Don't mention anything. I'm just coming to dinner.
Yeah.
So I left, and I went back to the seminary, and I waited for a week before I said or did anything. And after a week, I decided I should contact and begin a conversation. The conversation continued, and obviously I left the seminary and joined the Dominicans, which is interesting. I don't know what the rule exactly is. I know leaving an order, you don't accept them right away. But it was kind of out of the seminary to the religious order, which I don't know. I mean, maybe there was some different, but it was done with the seminary, with the vocations director. Even the vocations director had me talk to the auxiliary bishop at the time, who was a religious, and he was very nice and very helpful. And so I entered the Dominicans from that. And to say, it was interesting. I'd never had felt any call to preach or anything like that, but the preaching caught me. And of course the community.
The community life, yeah.
Especially the community, the sense of common. I remember actually thinking in the seminary, because I used to go work in a parish during the summers, and I remember saying, I don't think I'll do celibacy in this kind of situation. It's too alone. And I don't mean it as a critique of the diocesan. The diocesan has its own vocation, and obviously it wasn't mine. And so I entered the Dominicans for community and for something that caught my attention with the preaching. Also later, the intellectual life. I don't want to say necessarily study, although we speak a lot of study, but the intellectual life, that inquisitive interest in, it's kind of a contemplative, always searching to understand.
That's the part of the study people don't think about, that this is part of what Thomas calls, when he talks about contemplation, he doesn't mean that. So there's something in that, it's sparked by wonder and wanting to know more, the inquiry into something that is cultural wonder. I mean, there's both philosophical being and theological after that. Naturally, this is the way we're made.
Ultimately, our intellectual life is a search for God and a search for neighbor. It isn't just about coming up with new concepts and winning license and doctorates and blah, 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 publishing articles.
So you eventually got sent to Rome to study, but before that were you doing formation in the community? And then I forgot the timeline.
Well, I did my studies in the school, Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in California. This was part of still is part of the Graduate Theological Union, what they call the Holy Hill in Berkeley. And that was quite an interesting experience. Was it? Then at the end of that, since I had brought in a year of theology and I already had done philosophy, I finished in 3 years the requirements. And so they decided to send me to Europe to have an experience of the order beyond the borders of our little province. And it was a wonderful experience. I went and I spent a year in Fribourg, Switzerland, which is wonderful. And so I was in a house of studies with students from Italy, from Croatia, from Mexico. It was fantastic. It was, I wholeheartedly support their idea. I thought it was a great eye-opening to the vision of the order. Then I returned home, ordained a deacon already from Switzerland, and then I started working in campus ministry, which I did for 2 years. Then I was moved to a parish, which I did for 1 year as assistant pastor, and soon after that they assigned me as assistant novice master. And within 6 months of being assistant novice master, I was asked to be novice master elsewhere.
How did you make that shift? Did you find that difficult? Was it a seamless?
No, it wasn't. it was disorienting,
Why?
to tell you the truth. I was out 3 years of the studium. I had only been 3 years in ministry, and all of a sudden I was involved in formation.
Mm-hmm.
And formation really, I think, takes someone who is a little more mature in the life,
mm-hmm.
meaning the Dominican spirituality, the Dominican living, and just more experience. And I had very little. It's the period when we were running out of people because of all the people who left in the 70s and 80s, would have been middle age at that time, perfect people for being novice masters and directors of students. However, they weren't around, and the men who had been there had done their time 2 and 3 times.
Yeah.
And so I was called on to step up. Mm-hmm. And that's why it was disorienting. It was shortly out of initial formation to be back in initial formation as one directing it was very difficult. But it was a period of a lot of contemplation, I would say, because it's the novitiate deals with men who are coming to be initiated. That's how I describe it, to be initiated into the community. And so it's a time where you learn the history, you learn the spirituality, you kind of begin to gain a discipline in the prayer life, in the study life, hopefully, and so the living in common, which becomes the major problem. So it's really helping them. At the end, I always told them, I said, I take no credit for you being successful, and I take no credit for you not being successful. I only provided kind of a help for you to do it.
What did you find were the biggest challenges they were facing in formation? When you talk about community, that's always the biggest one, but what specifically?
In our case, was multicultural community. Mm-hmm. At that period, we had men coming from, they were living in the States, but they were coming from all different cultures, and they were different. I had Nigerians, Colombian with Nicaraguan, American from the Midwest, American from the South, and even that, if you're American, you know that it's not the same. People think American is all the same. No, we're not. And so you will have one culture's idea of schedule and rules is one way. Another culture's idea of schedule and rules is another. And of course, there is our vision of schedule and rules in the Dominican culture. But it's bringing them into to come up to that, to be able to talk to each other, to at least come to realize that their vision is not the absolute, that they may enter into conversation with another, and that ultimately they're coming into the Dominican order, and that there is a center that they're all trying to join that should gather them into one. And normally around Christmas, December, it was about to explode. And the novitiate is here. Normally it would always we would begin with this period of honeymoon, everybody's happy, everything's so wonderful, and then you notice they're beginning to eat a lot. And I would let them, you see lots of cookies and chocolates and things. You know what's going on. The world is disintegrating, and they need to rebuild themselves. And rebuild themselves in the order is the ideal of a novitiate. It's part of the process of initiation. But come December, there is no trace of that initial fire, and they've been disillusioned, which usually happens because they all come with visions of what it ought to be. But if they're willing to enter into what it is, they might find that they belong or don't belong. Some leave too early, and that's always regrettable, but some actually come to discern that they've come to a peace with what is there, they've come to understand it, and they've come to understand that it's not them. It's not who they are, and so they move on. Others come to a settle, where they've learned that, it's not all over yet, they still have more years to go after that, but an initial comfort with who you are as a Dominican, now is what comes about that time. That usually comes about April, May, and then they're ready to go in August. Around August, they move on to the House of Studies, and I get to start all over again. It's like, to anyone who's done novitiate work, they know it's exhausting. It's exhausting because you're walking with people who are really, we take everything from them. It's part of the process, but it is a very painful process because you leave your world, all your support, everything that defines you, and you move to a new place. Sure, you're excited about it, but you have none of your support because now you're going to make this yourself. Of course, you're not leaving behind, but you're interpreting a little bit of what we were discussing earlier. But you're now taking on this new identity that will bring you in, of course. But there has to be a certain period where you can do that, where you are prevented from running all your comfort zones.
Yeah, and you're left there without those supports, and in a way, just emotionally, psychologically deluded in front of everybody, and also you can't hide what's there as far as faults goes. Suddenly you have not just the mirror of your family members who perhaps put up all sorts of things, or your friends who overlook things, but other people in the community who may not. So they
never have to deal with you.
And you have to deal with them dealing with you and yourself, and that's not always an easy thing. And I imagine that's just difficult.
Part of the structure of Dominican life is the chapter. The community chapter. It has different shapes that it takes, but part of the shape it takes is conversation on our common life. And obviously the novices don't get to have chapter because they're not really friars, they're not involved, and they're not members in that sense. However, I used it as kind of we call the chapter. They knew it was kind of play. But I used that for them to start learning how to discuss and how to come to some kind of consensus. And you can't have consensus if people are not putting in goodwill into it. And usually you would see the one that was my way or the highway, and then that would usually end up bad. Because if you're joining something else, you kind of have to join it. And I don't mean an imposition or cookie cutting, but you are joining something else.
Yes, I mean even on the level of marriage with one person, part of it's going to be the compromise. You have to. It can't just be one person's way. It has to be. Oh,
she's sitting on my chair. I remember a story of someone. She sits on my chair and she puts the laundry in the wrong place. And this is a guy. It's kind of like that. Because it really is, in the end, it's those small things that become the big.
So you did that for how long?
That was for 4 years. I did 1 year as an assistant, and then right after that I was putting together a novitiate.
And then after that, you're probably grateful for the vacation from that. You thought, they send me back, break it.
Well, after that is when I asked to go for studies.
You asked? Oh, okay.
Yes.
It induced you, I see. Okay.
Well, to tell you the truth, when you've done a job like that, this is the way the brothers say it, so I'm not, you kind of get to write your own ticket.
Oh, I see. Oh, they know how to pump it.
Right? Of course, it's religious life, and if there is a rising need that they really need you to, it's a different picture. Which I would be willing to do. But at the time, it kind of opens up and you write your own ticket. So by then, originally my interest was to study art, but by then I was closing into 40 years old and sort of beginning formation in the arts just sort of seemed too far. So I asked to go study spirituality, given my interest over the years in spirituality, which I had never thought of it as an intellectual or as an academic pursuit. I was just interested. I read Teresa of Avila and loved it, and was really kind of trying to enter it. And I had read Centering Prayer, and I had read John of the Cross, and it always interested for my own pursuit in spirituality. So I said, I'm going to go study. And I was interested in the Angelicum because with whatever little knowledge I had of spirituality as it was in the States in general, my sense was that it turned too much to psychology. Mm-hmm. And I was interested more in a theological vision and understanding. And the Angelicum had spiritual theology, and that attracted me. Mm-hmm. And so I was allowed and permitted, and so I came to the Angelicum.
And what were you looking to study?
Well, I mean, I was...
Or did you know at that point? You thought
I had no idea exactly what this was. I just knew I was interested in people like Teresa and John of the Cross and Catherine of Siena I had read, which for years puzzled me what she meant by the true self. And I just was censor in a defense of a dissertation on Catherine of Siena. Just finished right now. And she's a doctor right now. She did a wonderful job. And in her dissertation, she spoke of the experience of Catherine of a coming to know yourself as a nothing. Mm-hmm. Not in a negative sense, but that you owe everything to God. And in that discovery was a turning, and that's the true self, was a turning to find how much God had given you, and the incredible generosity that you have received, and the amazing dignity of being an image of God. And so it sort of opens up this whole world of in Catherine's doctrine of desire for God, having learned of God's desire for you. In any case, finally it opened up for me what Catherine of Siena meant, your true self. I said, that makes lots of sense. It's beautiful. Anyway, I came, and so I was, what do you do when you study spirituality? Or not just read saints, in their writing.
Well, right, most people think about it as something that's going to lead you to devotional practices. Or on the other side of it, you mentioned psychology, and they stop there, and it doesn't go any further. It stops at the emotions and how to deal with them. And yeah, that has a place, but you do have to, eventually that has to be assumed up into the spiritual, otherwise you're just staying at the level of the natural.
Yes. And in our case, we are interested in knowing that experience, that meeting point of the person with God. Mm-hmm. And so that life in the Spirit that we've been granted. And so when we look at a saint's experience, or even a cultural experience in that Spirit of God, we're looking to understand the nature of that experience, of that contact with God, the experience and the process a person goes through. It's a way of understanding how we move in the Spirit of God to God. And so you're looking at the spirit, what we call the spiritual theologies of people who have had intense lives in the Spirit. But today we also have opened the field to look into places where we didn't before. Instead of just the great mystics, we also look into the experiences of, let's say, people who do this devotion. What's going on? How is that helping them? What's moving? And sort of to understand the movement of the Holy Spirit in our lives. So, I mean, I remember when I first came, I don't think he was very positive, but it was a very fruitful thing. One of the professors, of course, we get to live with each other, and so you live with all the professors while you're sitting here as a Dominican. And so I was at a table, and the professor who who's back then taught in social sciences, he's no longer here. He just turned to me and he says, "What is spirituality? What is the phenomena you study?" To tell you the truth, I mean, I tried my best, but it left a question in my head that really stirred, because when we say spirituality, what do we mean? And when we say we study spirituality, what are we studying? What is it that we're studying? And of course, I come to find out there's a whole history of essays and works on past the period when we did the traditional spiritual theology, maybe by the time you get to the 80s, 70s, late 70s, 80s, and spirituality has exploded out of the borders of the Catholic Church, out of the borders of Christianity, even out of the borders of faith. Spirituality has become this thing that everybody's into today, out of religion, out of faith. It's kind of, there's this whole series of articles and studies that are going on from around late 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, up to recent 2000s, trying to figure out then what is the object of our studies, and what is the subject that we study, what is it, and how do we study it. And so there's this whole rich, I have a class on that. It's called Methods in Spiritual Theology.
Yeah, because you're looking at devotions or the life of the saints, and maybe how they matured in their experience, what their encounter with God was like. I'm thinking just John the Cross because I had to do something for that, and how his life and his experiences formed spirituality, the kind of tonality he has in his writing. But beyond that, is there a method?
Yeah, there used to be a way of looking at those experiences and explaining them with Thomistic metaphysics and anthropology. That's where it was in the 30s, late 1800s. But today we've come to the question of experience.
Yeah.
And so the whole field of hermeneutics has come in. But it must be done with lots of care, or you can easily be derailed. For example, when you're looking at a person's experience in context, you can so easily be derailed into the context, the culture, their history, and you may end up doing a history of that person or a study of their culture, where those would actually be help to understand this person's experience of the Spirit. You can also lose sight of the faith and lose sight of what they believe or the religion, and you get caught in the psychology of their experience.
Right. Reducing it to that, rather than looking at maybe this, for those in the faith, saying there's something universal here for those who are on the path to God, and what here is going to not just apply to the person 500 years ago, but to me as well. How do you discern that out of all the other things, historical context and psychological?
In fact, that is claimed by some as part of the method of the study of spirituality, because if you're truly a person studying spirituality, you're interested in spirituality for yourself, for others. Obviously, there's an objective aspect of it that you're trying to aim at, but it can't be entirely outside of you. You have to apply some methods so that your objectivity. But you cannot deny and you cannot completely leave yourself out, because there's also an interest in you in growing in spirituality, and there should be also an interest in you in helping others grow in spirituality, which is part of the field of spirituality. And so you would be interested in understanding how is this person experiencing this, or how much can I get to their experience. It's a lot to claim to get at that experience. So you look at this whole culture, theology, so everything that's involved, psychology, the anthropology, and to try and understand why this person may be saying this, if you have any kind of writing, because you're always interpreting some kind of sign, text that people either are putting out right now, if you're investigating an actual group of people. Let's say if you're studying spirituality in the charismatic renewal, you have something that's alive and going. And so you're going to now apply some anthropological principles, sociological, all kinds of things to understand it. But very careful that you don't get caught enough, but always are aiming at that point of contact with God to try and understand. They're going to be speaking of it, and of course they're going to be using their culture so that you can get through to where they're getting at it. Of course, you're going to relate somewhat to it to understand some of it. There's a point in spirituality that you can't just study it from the outside, unless you're going to be in religious studies. But if you're really going to enter into the spirituality, you can't study Catholic spirituality and not be somewhat involved in the Catholic life and understanding. I don't know how, I don't know exactly how far we need to claim that. But it's really hard to understand the things we do and say from the outside.
Yes.
We can explain them by exterior ideas. We can explain them psychologically. We can explain them anthropologically. We can explain them sociologically. But we're not getting at that experience of the Spirit.
No, and it's always going to be a bit of obscurity anyway. And, the mind's not, it doesn't rest well with that. It's clarity. And the faith comes in, but it's always going to be a little bit of that darkness because you're dealing with God. And you're the creature of the Creator. You're finite, and you're going towards what is infinite, and you have these infinite desires for that. But you feel, sometimes you can feel untethered in that search because it is a bit dark, and maybe you only see a step in front of you, if that, and you make acts of faith and trust going forward, and whatever.
Ultimately, we're talking about experience of something we really can't see, or know entirely. Mm-hmm. But we've been given a lot of help, a lot of revelation, and certainly the Holy Spirit and grace. But if you're not part of that, there is something that will be missing in your study.
Yeah, you can't put under a microscope, right? And just study it completely outside of yourself. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's true.
You can.
So, so you came to some of these realizations when you came to study here.
Oh, this is a longer period. But
this is overall.
I was just giving you that. Coming here, having been questioned in that way, kind of
led you into consideration.
Made me consider a lot. But along the way, I had been exposed to some ideas on community when I was in studies in theology. And there was a brother who was studying ecclesiology, and he was studying it from the perspective of community. And so he was looking at an American philosopher, not very well known, although he's becoming a little more and more known. He's from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. His name is Josiah Royce. And he just sort of talked about him. I never actually read him when I was there, but he talked about him and community, and of course he was doing his doctoral dissertation on it. So if you ever met a doctor, don't ask what they're doing unless you're willing to spend a long time with it. So
they're living and breathing and eating it. You can't stay inside.
So he was living in the same house. I happened to be a brother who was interested, and so.
Let's not share.
Well, I found it interesting. I had been interested in community. As I said, I entered the Dominicans. Something attracted me about community. In that, of course, as I said earlier, a Dominican is always in wonder, searching, trying to understand, and our contemplation towards God is actually pretty active. And so, when I came here, I said, I heard about spirituality of communion. Nobody was teaching about it, but I heard about it. St. John Paul was talking about it at the time. And so I said, I'm going to do my license thesis on spirituality of communion. So I went and I investigated everything I could, and turns out there wasn't a lot. John Paul II had written a lot and mentioned it many, many times. And then there were some people who had picked it up. A lot of it was coming out of communion ecclesiology. So they were talking about we need a spirituality of communion. There were lots of talks about it, but nothing was systematic. And so there wasn't really any real study of it. There's just people talking about it. So I gathered up all the information, made kind of a systematic study of it, and organized it, and that was my license thesis. Of course, I was here for a doctorate, so I didn't know I had to do a license thesis before I got a doctorate. I just came for a doctorate. I was surprised when I arrived. So what could have been 2 years became 5. But it was, the journey was fantastic, and everything is learning. So after that, I said, I had noticed that a lot of people talking about spirituality of communion ended up always in something social. Social meaning care for one another, living some kind of care, solidarity. The word solidarity was around. And then, of course, there was the sacramental life, uniting us to the church, and the usuals. But outside of giving kind of the ecclesiological basis and speaking of the Holy Spirit involvement in the union and communion in the church and these social kind of realities of caritas in terms of solidarity between communities, between peoples, there wasn't much on what I would say spirituality. To understand, let's say, the spirituality, the experience of the spirituality of communion. And so I began to look, and I found that whenever people were talking about ecclesial spirituality, or they were talking about communion spirituality, it was always the same. It always went to what we ought to do. It kind of became a social, moral, ethical realities, what we do for one another, how we... I said, this can hardly hold us to spirituality. You can talk about social science, you can talk about social ethics, you can talk about, sociopolitical, but not really spirituality. So I became very interested in how can we possibly speak of ourselves as a community having a spirituality.
Because you hear the phrase, building community, but it stays on the horizontal.
How do you do that?
How do you do that in reference to God as opposed to our own actions with each other? That the other comes first. And what does that mean? It doesn't just happen by accident or automatically.
So as I inquired and researched, I remembered that philosopher, and I started talking to my brother, and I came eventually to realize that, of course, he was working on ecclesiology and was looking at Josiah Royce's because there was something there. And of course, Josiah Royce is not an ecclesiologian, and he wasn't. He was doing philosophy. His interest was understanding B. But he wrote this 2-volume work called The Problem of Christianity, which is very deceiving as a name, because it sounds like he has an issue with Christianity, or Christianity has a big issue or a problem. But it was a completely different idea, and he really was using that idea as a springboard to explain what he calls his metaphysics of community. You don't really get to it till the 2nd volume, so you must be really committed. Because in the 1st volume, the actual question of Christianity is, how do we continue to live in that spirit of Christ over history? And so he looks at Christianity, how much changes, how many things are different in the history, how many things are done differently. Of course, he was raised in a Protestant group, and he wasn't really ever a member of a community, of a Christian community, or let alone the Catholic Church. And so, which was a critique given to him by a fellow. He says, you talk so much of Christianity, you haven't joined the church. In any case. His point was, how does Christianity remain in the Spirit of Christ? And then he comes to, because of the Spirit of Christ. It's what holds it together. So even though things look, feel, act differently at any time in history, it is the Spirit of Christ that is being manifest. Of course, let aside what is not the Spirit of Christ, the things that we do that are sinful and so forth. But what he was getting at is, would St. Paul, if he were to come back today, would he recognize Christianity, the Spirit of Christ? And his point is that the Spirit of Christ is what unified the whole Christianity, the whole of Christianity over centuries. Because his whole point is that the Spirit is the unifying principle of a multitude of individuals, so to speak, into a real community. So the Spirit is, what he speaks of is the interpreting Spirit. And what the Spirit does is interpret into a community.
Now explain this idea of interpreting.
It's more than what we mean usually by interpretation. We usually speak of this means that. He was coming from the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce, another American philosopher, and rather a logician, mathematician, very difficult mind, who told him to study logic when he read his works. He says, oh, there's something worthwhile in there, but you really should study logic. So Josiah went and studied logic. And so he came to understand this, what I call, coming out of a Thomistic world, since we speak of powers of the Spirit, the faculties of the Spirit, let's say this is a faculty of the Spirit, although he would not say that, of interpretation. And it's not just a this means that, but it's rather a gathering that is either actively or becoming. For example, when you look at a plastic cup, it's a plastic cup. But if you look at it, that plastic cup has a whole history of ideas, inventions, discoveries. It's long. An enormous number of individual ideas, discoveries, doing this, that are interpreted into a plastic cup. That's an interpretation. Is this amazing capacity of the Spirit to interpret all these different individuals into a community. So if we go back to the plastic cup is a community of all those individual ideas and instances, but it is one. It is one plastic cup. And it is the Spirit that does that. So in a community, in his metaphysics of community, in the being in the world, we are individuals and we are communities. Real communities have real individuals, not just automatons, copies of one another, but true individuals. And true individuals are members of a community. And so, for example, it's a lot more involved. When he talks about how we become members of a community, he says we do so, he uses this by loyalty. Loyalty he doesn't mean by, I will do whatever you tell me, yes, yes, yes. It's more of a Roman pietas. It's a sort of bringing yourself to join the identity and hopes of that community, and therefore to get there, you begin by willingly, and that is your own interpreting Spirit, you interpret yourself into the past of that community. So that community's past becomes your past. One example I've used to explain the process is, I lived in Miami for many years, and if you know anything about Miami, there's lots of Cubans. Yes. Cubans who came from Cuba. But they've integrated themselves into the United States and its history and its traditions. And so I remember being invited to celebrate Thanksgiving in a Cuban home. And of course I expected Thanksgiving, turkey, stuffing, yam, But it wasn't just the turkey. Of course the turkey was covered in garlic and done the Cuban way. And there were rice and beans, and there was yuca, and there was this whole gathering. But they were interpreting the history of the pilgrims coming to the earth. However, that is in kind of a made-up story or whatever historians tell us today. But the truth is that it's part of our identity. And so you are American, you celebrate Thanksgiving. So they celebrate Thanksgiving. But of course, that Thanksgiving also involved the Cuban.
Mm-hmm.
So the same way, when an individual joins a community, even as a child you're doing this, you begin to define yourself by that history of that community. So you are joining the spirit of that community. And that spirit has a will to interpret a self into a future.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's what he called the hope of the community, the future, what we call mission sometimes, what we call our hope. And so the individual will begin to define himself, and his own history becomes incorporated through his own spirit into that community spirit, to the point that his identity becomes also the identity of the community. But it is his own individual identity.
Yes.
And he becomes an individual of that community spirit.
And becomes part of the history and all that eventually, and appropriates all of this.
And becomes a contributing member
right.
of that community.
And even just thinking along with the mind of it, we were talking earlier about how eventually the I becomes the we. At some point.
Yes, and you don't have to leave the I.
No, you don't have to leave the I, right.
Because the I, the we becomes the I, and the I is in the we. And the realization of that is what, it's not something that is that mysterious to human beings. Except today with individualism, we have lost the sense of where we come from. It's interesting how much we despise history and traditions and past, because it holds us back, so we think. When in turn it actually energizes us and it gives us a self. It doesn't impose itself on us when we're talking about a real community. It doesn't impose itself on us, asking us to be a little copy of everyone else, but it gives us a spirit that we live out of. And so our self is rich, and it has a future. It has a hope. And so what I found there is a gathering in the spirit of a community. So you can begin to understand, of course these are philosophical terms, you can begin to understand how we can live in the spirit as a community.
Now, when he was talking about living in the Spirit, meaning something else, not someone's listening and thinking the Holy Spirit. It's not what he's talking about.
No.
How do you make it bridge from one to the other?
Right. He doesn't do it.
Right.
In fact, at some point, you're going to have to. My censor asked me to put a little footnote, because if you don't know, you could start thinking that what this philosopher is talking about is the church, and that the spirit of the church is the spirit of the church, the spirit of Christ, so that there is some sort of hypostatic union in the spirit. And so you have to say he's not doing ecclesiology, he's talking about being, and he's using the history of Christianity to talk about it. But, for example, there is a just human spirit of which communities exist, bad communities and good communities, where people kind of join a community. If it's a bad community, it really is leading you.
Yeah, what's a bad community?
A community that's destructive, that it's hateful, that it's destructive of its individuals. It's not a real community. A community that a racist community is a bad community. It's one that is really not bringing together. It's not becoming one. It's a community gathered by a bad spirit, we could say, in our faith. We could say it's an evil community because it's gathered by an evil spirit. As opposed to a community that is seeking truth, a community that is seeking a better future, this community that is seeking salvation. So when you come to faith, you can't just take philosophy and plug it in. You begin to, so all I was looking for was a concept of spirit that would give me kind of a way of beginning to talk about our life in common in the spirit. But of course now we're speaking of a spirit that is not a human spirit, is the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ. And the history we are incorporating ourselves. By incorporating ourselves into the Spirit of Christ is the history of Christ. And so the shape we're taking as individuals is the shape of Christ, the shape of His community, the shape of the body of Christ. And of course, this is happening in the sacraments. It's one of my. There's all this talk of enculturation, and I had the hardest time trying to figure out why we actually had to have bread. It's the period, the time I was formed. It was the big gung-ho years of enculturation, and we were all it's a wonderful thing. It's just that we had to be careful, and we got all excited about it. And so the question of why can't the Chinese use rice cakes instead of, because that's a lot more meaningful to them as food and than wheat wafers for the Eucharist. But you see, when you're incorporating yourself into the history of a community, into the spirit of a community, that comes with it, let's say, like the Thanksgiving meal. You can add some of the culture of the Cuban to it, but at some point it has to remain recognizable. So, because it's a sacrament and Thanksgiving are not anywhere near, but just to sort of jump into that. So, the story of Christ, the history of Christ, the flesh of Christ, it is in the sacrament that we're fed into it, and that we are through them incorporated into Christ. So they're not arbitrary at that point. So water has to be water. You can't baptize people in orange juice just because for them it's more meaningful. No, there is a history, that there is a sign that's involved that already has a community aspect to it. So when we looked at it in ecclesiology, it was Pope Benedict speaking of, there's kind of something that comes from the outside that has to remain respected when you are coming into and enculturating into the local church, that needs to remain. And of course I got all confused on the universal local. Are you trying to impose Rome? But in any case, you remember that conversation in class. But you take on this, and it's, of course, these are signs, but they're signs that now it involves grace and the Holy Spirit. It's not just the human spirit or the human spirit of a community. The Spirit moving in us is the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of God. And so you move by that power of the Spirit to interpret yourself through these sacraments, through these signs, to something greater than yourself, into Christ. And so you can begin speaking of the movement of our life in common in the Spirit. In a way, I mean, that's a very brief explanation. There's a lot more to it that ended up being my work, my dissertation.
How have you been able to, if you could say apply it, I don't know if you can do that, I mean, or if you could see how somebody might if they were in formation, or what are some of the things you would tell communities that, what may perhaps ones that started out well, something's gone wrong, somewhere along the way. I mean, this happens in various religious communities like with crisis.
Right, and today we're dealing with the fact that people are mostly individualists, not necessarily, I mean, they're living in that spirit of that community of individualists, which is a disintegrating spirit. It's an evil spirit. But that's kind of, let's say, if you are in the United States and you come into a community, probably already the community is suffering from some of that. So it's a very...
It's tough because on the other side of it, you may have some that see the problem with individualism and then want the unity so much, but at the expense of the individuals also. And suddenly that's lost, and that can't be an answer either. I mean, you have to find...
Well, the other extreme of it, one extreme is the individualist. The other extreme is this idea that that brother of mine used to explain it in terms of, he never watched Star Trek, but this one time he watched Star Trek. And this was the next generation where we have the Borg. And the Borg, if you don't know Star Trek, the Borg is this sort of group of aliens, but of many planets and cultures and peoples, that have been sort of forced into this one mind. But there is no self in any of them. There is no integration into the one spirit or the one mind. It's rather you are assimilated. That's kind of what some people think is the best way to do community. You assimilate. This is who we are. Of course, who gets to interpret who we are? Of course, when you're speaking in church term, we already have our, but even that is resisted. We have our own structures and our own moments of authority ordained by God. Some of them other structures are structures that we need, that we have come up with. So those are the two extremes. One of the extremes says you just assimilate to this amalgam. Knowing human beings, nobody actually ever assimilates. I mean, I was watching, if you look at a group of religious, all wearing the same habit, you look, all the habits look the same, but you stay and keep looking, and you begin to find some habits have a different tone than others. Some are longer, some are shorter, some have this kind of way of cutting it, and the other ones have another way of it. The Spirit always interprets an individual, but from a community and into a community. Otherwise, it disintegrates. And so, yes, there will always be, hopefully there will be always, that's the richness, that's the charisms, the many charisms in the churches. The Spirit always interprets into this multiplicity, but the multiplicity is always for the community. It is always gathered in that community.
What's the fear of the multiplicity?
Because we have disintegrated. Because of individuals who are not really, to use Josiah's terms, loyal to the community, but rather they have simply interpreted kind of their own sort of self. It's a very strange reality because it also participates of a common vision. I am the source of my truth. I get to define myself. But really, if you think about it, that's coming out of a common idea. The idea that we each define ourselves. So you are participating of the community of the individualists. And in a way, you participate of that community, and you're a member of that community, but it's a disintegrating spirit.
It leaves out many things that you cannot choose for yourself. I mean, that's the thing, you're at the starting point, but you don't look back. It's what brought you there.
To become specific, you always leave out something.
Yeah.
It's just the nature of it. So the Spirit multiplies itself, keeps communicating itself, but gathers. Because as an individual appears out of the community spirit, he appears as a member of the community, but as an individual.
Yeah.
That's why he says true communities have true individuals.
That's right, and that would make the community stronger, not weaker. Whereas the fear on the part of those who want the assimilation, they want something really homogenous.
Eventually that dies.
That does die, right.
Yeah. But in this spiritual community where you become a true member, a true individual in this true community, you become a participating member. So the gift that you are, let's look at the church, the charisms given by the Spirit are not to distinguish us from one another, but each one is received an individual charism to a certain extent, a charism to build the body. In our case would be the love. It would be love, caritas, which gathers us into that communion. It always is towards further communion and further movement to our end, to our hope, which is living in God in heaven in one communion.
Why do you think that the Dominican...
Natalia, we're ready to close.
We've got 2 minutes. That went by so quickly. Oh, we're going to have you back.
Poor Mary. Poor Mother Mary.
Well, as a good mother, she knows the mother of the community, right? So without we wouldn't even be here talking about this. So, oh boy. Well, okay. That's well. Thank you very much, Father. This is a fascinating conversation. I'd love to have you back sometime. We can continue this, and so I appreciate you being here. Sure. And maybe you can close with a short blessing.
Let us pray for God's Spirit. God, send us your Spirit. May He gather us in your body. May He gather us in your community. May He move us to our end, your life in communion, your life, the life of God, 3 in 1. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. And we'll be back next week with Natalia and the program Just Plain Theology from Rome, Sweet Rome, at the same time, same station. And may God bless each and every one of you. We'll see you then next week. Thanks, Natalia. Thanks, Father.
Thank you, Bob.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.